Well, welcome back to our study on becoming God's people, and we're working through the book of Genesis. Today we're in Genesis 22, which many people find as one of the most difficult passages in the entire Bible because the character that we often associate with God of loving, kind, generous doesn't seem to be on display here. Rather, God asks Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, and we really shouldn't downplay that. We should embrace this tension and see if there are ways to work through it, but we should not sidestep that controversy that really hurts a lot of people's ability to fully encounter this particular text. We should be generous to people and recognize that this is a struggle for some. With that being said, I would like to work into the text a little bit and to think about it. But to start with, I'm going to fast forward to another completely different idea, and that is how many Christians through the centuries have analogized this text and seen in it a foreshadowing of the sacrifice of Jesus. Their concept is the language used of Isaac as Abraham's only or unique son is also used of Jesus in John chapter 3. And so the parallel has often been played out that what God does not accept here in Genesis 22, where Abraham tries to offer Isaac and God does not accept that and goes a different direction, God is willing to make that same sacrifice of Abraham, only this time it is more perfect, and therefore God will accept it. This is somewhat problematic theology. Not that we can't make some parallels and some good analogies there, but ultimately it is somewhat problematic because it misidentifies the purpose of sacrifice. It also, I don't think, does justice to the original text as well. And I just think there are better ways to understand everything altogether. So I don't really dwell on that theology. Again, it's not that it's inherently malicious in some way. You can probably make better analogies than the ones I can come up with. There are probably people who can play that analogy up better, but it's also not found in the Bible. It's not in the New Testament. There are passages that allude to Abraham's faith in offering Isaac. James comes to mind, Hebrews comes to mind. They both talk about how Abraham's faith is on display in offering Isaac, but there's no express comparison between the story of Abraham's binding of Isaac and the offering of Jesus. And for me, if I'm going to make that connection, I at least want to see some of it developed in the Bible, and it's just not there. So I leave it alone for the most part, for those reasons. But it has been a motif throughout Christian history to play up that connection between Jesus's fulfilling sacrifice and the aborted attempt at the sacrifice of Isaac. Now, I've mentioned that Hebrews and James both talk about Abraham's faith in connection, to some degree, in connection with this passage. But I don't think we should simply take that to mean that there's this arbitrary test that one day Abraham woke up and God just arbitrarily said, hey, one more thing. Let's test you one more time and see if you can pass. I don't think that is a proper interpretation. And I really don't think that's what the author of Hebrews or James is talking about. I don't think that's what they're getting at when they want to play up Abraham's faith. Rather, especially in Hebrews, we see Abraham's faith is not connected just to this passage. It's connected to his entire life. And so to limit Abraham's faith to this particular test, it doesn't work really well. And I know a lot of people would like to simplify it to that. I just don't think it's a good option. So let me talk about some of the things that I do think are good or better options. And that is, number one, we should look at the text itself. Let's look at this passage. To start off with, the first few verses are God coming in and telling Abraham of this new test. To start off with, he's told to get up and go. There's only one other place where that exact phrase, get up and go, is used, and that is in Genesis 12, when Abraham is first called out of his pagan environment and told to get up and go. That alone should tell us that there's a connection back to Genesis 12. On top of that, in Genesis 12, Abram at the time is told, get up and go to a land that I will show you. Well, here again, he is told, get up and go to a place where I will show you, a mountain in the land of Moriah. Now, both of those are get up, go, trust. Trust in the unknown. So we have another tie. And then we have a three-part clause in each one of those callings. We have Abraham, get up, go to a place that you don't know, and I will show you. And a three-part discussion of family, particularly how he is going to lose his family members. He's going to lose those who are dear to him. So you have get up, go to a place that you don't know, but I'll show you. And then three different clauses about how you're going to lose your family. This is an effective tool to tie it back to Genesis 12. This story and Genesis 12 bookend Abraham's life. The only stories that we have, the only real story we have about Abraham at all after this is the death of Sarah. We don't really have stories about Abraham. This is the last real story of Abraham in the Bible, and it's definitely his last encounter with God. So what we have, the first encounter Abram has with God and the last encounter Abraham has with God are bookended with the same clauses, the same rhetorical style. This is very intentional. What it is telling us is that we should look back at this event not simply as a one-off event, but as the culmination of his life. Every lesson that that God has been trying to get him to learn is now put on display. Now, beyond that, we have connections back to two different accounts that both involve Ishmael and Hagar. One is in Genesis 16, the other is in Genesis 21. We're going to start with Genesis 21 first. Genesis 21, Abraham gets up early in the morning and does all of the work in preparation for Ishmael and Hagar to leave. The same is true in Genesis 22, where Abraham gets up early in the morning and does all of the work in preparation for the journey. This is not something Abraham should have done. Abraham should have delegated this to his servants. To read that Abraham does this himself instead of delegating it to those inferiors shows something. Shows something about Abraham's character and about the situation that is going on. Now, that means that God is trying to tell him something about how he has treated Ishmael also. There is a connection to the loss of Ishmael with the loss of Isaac. Further, when we get down to the end of the story, when God says to when Abraham finally concludes the test, he discovers the Lord who sees. This is the name of God, YHWH in the Hebrew text, who sees. That is the exact same description of Hagar's encounter with God. She says, I met the God who sees. She doesn't use a personal name for God. She uses a more generic title, God. but she still encounters the one who sees. Abraham also discovers the one who sees. The only difference is the personal name that Abraham knows. Now, here's the thing. He has found something that Hagar found. He has found out. And what we have discovered in Genesis 16 and again in Genesis 21 is that God blessed Ishmael, provided for Ishmael, protected Ishmael, blessed Ishmael in a lot of different ways. In the exact same way that God blesses Isaac, there's something here that I think many Christians forget, and that is that God is going to bless everyone, not just the one who inherits what we call the blessing. We know, and Abraham knew, that Isaac was the son of the promise. The blessing would go through him. That is, the blessing of Abraham's land, his possessions, the promises going forward to Abraham, the covenant of God. Isaac was to inherit that. But that doesn't mean that Ishmael was excluded. Too often we get hung up on Isaac inherits the blessing, or Jacob inherits the blessing, or Joseph, or one of his brothers inherit the blessing. But that's not what we're supposed to see. What we are supposed to see is God also provided for Ishmael. God provided for Esau. The difference between the story of Isaac and Ishmael and Jacob and Esau and Joseph and his brothers is that whereas Joseph tries hard to keep all of his brothers together, something that I'm intending to look at next week, where Joseph works to maintain the family unity, his ancestors, his father and grandfather and great-grandfather, did not work to preserve that family unity. The blessings that were supposed to be a part of the family are not limited to one individual, even if that individual's offspring are to inherit the major blessing. God still wants to provide richly for all of Abraham's family. God still tells Hagar, I'm going to do great things through Ishmael. And had they maintained a close family connection, well, perhaps we would have seen a different outcome to the story. And I think that's one of the things that the test is about. The test of Abraham is for him to recognize how he has treated his family in the past and how he could have treated them and what he should have done and how God's character is still treating them. He had not provided enough food and water for Ishmael and Hagar to leave and to establish themselves. He provided them with scanty resources where God blessed them abundantly. Here he sees that, I'm supposed to really deeply care about all of the family, not just the son who's promised. I think there's something to that. Further, I think that God is trying to show Abraham a little bit of the divine character, because Abraham would have expected the gods of that time to require things like child sacrifices. The people believed that the deities had a character that was capricious, that would turn on a dime, that would require things like child sacrifice. That's who people believed God to be. And I think that there's something in this that says to Abraham, look, you expect God to be this way, but God's character is such that human life is valuable. And God's going to provide for people rather than see human life extinguished. I further think that there is something that's missed very, very frequently. It's easy to overlook, especially in English, because most English translations don't seem to pick up on this, but a lot of scholars talk about it. It's one of these weird things where I can't figure out why scholars talk about this again and again. And English translations don't seem to pick up on it. But there's this little particle. It's a tiny little word in God's speech to Abraham to take Isaac. And it's this little particle, na. And it's in the what we call the command to take Isaac, your son. And that little word, what it does is it takes that form from a command to not just a request, but something more akin to, how would you like to? Or what do you think about? Or at least, at the very least, please would you? In other words, God is very much inviting Abraham into this story. This is not God demanding the life of Isaac. This is God saying, give me your son, please. And there's a lot of things that we could do with that. And we could go on to some speculative roads about whether God meant literally sacrificing Isaac, or if Abraham misheard God, or what God exactly meant on all of this. And there's a lot of ways we can do that. But I really don't think that we get into those weeds today, because they're very speculative. And while that kind of reading of the text can be very comforting for some, I don't know that it's justifiable completely. So I'm not going to go down that road too much, but there is a truth that God is very much inviting Abraham along for the journey, and not giving a command. This is, Abraham, you can back out of this at any time. I want to see how far down this path you're going to go. And when Abraham proves himself willing to go the whole way, then God provides a miraculous outlet. Again, there's a lot of ways we can understand that. Some people understand that Abraham failed the test by thinking God would require a human sacrifice. I don't know if I'd go that far, but some people do. Some people say that Abraham passed the test, and that the test was to walk with God and discover God's true character, the God who sees. I can get behind that a lot more, where what Abraham can choose to do is to protect his own name and run the other way, or he can walk down the path trusting the character of God that he has learned, the character of God that protected Sodom, or wanted to. For any righteous person, Sodom would have been protected. Abraham knew this. He bickered with God about that. He knew God's character of protecting and preserving life. And are you willing to trust God's character that you know, this one of protecting and preserving life, all the way to the end, even if it doesn't seem like that's what's happening? I think there's something to that. And I think that we can learn and grow through wrestling with that. This is not a passage, I know I say this a lot, but especially here, this is not a passage that should be read over once and think you understand it. This is a passage to come back to again and again and again and ask questions about it, because it really does help you to see what your expectations of God are, and how you can wrestle through those. I think there is something to Abraham saw God, knew God through everything he had been through, and knew that God wanted to preserve life, and yet trusted the word that he heard from God all the way through, knowing that God would somehow protect and provide. And in the end, he was justified because God's character proved true, even when it looked like it was dark. So I hope you got something out of that. As always, if you've watched to the end of this, blessings on you. And if I can improve these videos in any way, great. If you have questions, comments, let me know. I'd really like to make these a lot better, at least hit you a lot better. So let me know in the comments what you think. Get a hold of me. Until I meet you again, God bless.